I am Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Yeah, we're gonna revisit a story from a while ago that new revelations. LIBOR rigging, and the Bank of England. Uh-oh, Stacey.
Well, I actually had some other stories planned, and then this story happened, but they actually go together so well. So the headline reads, LIBOR, Bank of England implicated in secret recording. So apparently somebody within Barclays actually recorded a conversation between Peter Johnson, the guy who set the LIBOR rate for Barclays. He was sentenced to prison for his role in rigging the LIBOR rate. But in this conversation, he is speaking with one of his bosses, Mark Dearlove. And Mark Dearlove, in that conversation, tells him, you've got to lowball LIBOR. And the guy who's now in prison, or was sentenced to prison, he says, I can't do that, that's against the law. He says, no, the government and the Bank of England want you to do this. So he did it, and here we are.
Well, as we reported at the time, just looking at the market, you could see that it was being manipulated. You know, markets do reflect a certain supply and demand. If there's a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers, a lot of participants, you can tell what's happening and how prices are moving. And in this case, prices were not moving based on the actual evidence of the market. And we said, look, this is clear evidence that somebody's manipulating this market. We made the case. A lot of people backed us up. The mainstream media in the UK, principally the BBC, refused to cover the story as such because, of course, the markets are too confusing for them. Oh, they need experts. And now it's come out, yes, in fact, they were manipulating the interest rates down, which, of course, is needed to keep the Ponzi scheme going, to keep the bailouts flowing, to keep the artificiality of property bubble percolating. And what will happen at this point is anyone's guess.
So it's important to understand in this situation that Paul Tucker at the Bank of England and Bob Diamond, who was the CEO of Barclays at the time, testified before Congress. Not Congress, but Parliament. I don't know if they were under oath. I doubt it very much. But basically, they said they had never heard of this thing called lowballing, but this shows that they were, it was otherwise. But also, trillions and trillions of dollars of contracts around the world are based on this. All those municipalities were hit by their own interest rate derivatives that they are based on LIBOR, and municipalities and towns across the world, including in America, which are going bankrupt, they had to pay more than they otherwise would because of this situation.
Right, think of the Royal Bank of Scotland scandal, where they had a subsidiary, the Global Restructuring Group. One bank would force small to medium enterprises into bankruptcy so that the other division of the same bank could swoop in, pick up assets for pennies on the dollar, and resell them again, and they destroyed thousands of UK businesses. Well, this is done on a global basis where a lot of these so-called credit default swaps are tied to interest rates, and they are triggered if certain interest rates scenarios develop. And in this case, because the LIBOR rate was manipulated, the scenario, sure enough, was triggered, and the cost skyrocketed for municipalities and institutions and banks across the world and forced a lot of folks into bankruptcy. And again, all the lawyers made out, the bankers made out, complete and utter fraud. And one can postulate that this was done like an exploding improvised device along the road that kills a lot of US and UK soldiers. Okay, here you have bankers, they put an improvised exploding LIBOR device by the highway of finance, and they make it explode to kill people. And that's an act of aggression that should be punished as such. So don't cry about, you know, cops getting blown up on bridges if you're not going to go after bankers suiciding
I want to say
people.
Also during all these interest rate rigging and manipulation, you see a lot of the property bubble caused by the central banks intervening on behalf of a certain class of people. You might hear some of the construction going on. That's from the tallest residential building on Central Park.
This is Billionaires Row.
Yes, mostly owned by Chinese investors.
Thanks to manipulated interest rates like LIBOR.
Yes. Right behind us is another half of the building on the top floor of that building over there is owned by Bono, the other half by Demi Moore, who's trying to sell it for $75 million.
That's the new Goldman Sachs headquarters, the Twin Towers.
Yes. So I want to put this into context of what they are telling the ordinary person that does not have the authority of the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve Bank or the government of the United States or United Kingdom and manipulating interest rates on their behalf. Here's a little piece of advice given to Generation X sorts like myself about why they have such little money saved up for retirement. The median is $69,000 that somebody in the Generation X generation has. Market Watch, Dow Jones Market Watch says, Generation X, don't slack on your retirement. And so they go through a whole number of reasons, including the fact that should you just save $550 a month, and assuming a return of 7%, they say, then you'll just have $990,000 when you retire. How are you going to save? How are you going to get a return of 7% when the Bank of England is manipulating, lowballing interest rates lower? So how is that possible?
Well, I mean, it touches on the entire pension crisis. You know, pensions are not getting anywhere near the 7% they have said that they need to return folks money that they paid into these schemes. And again, because bankers are manipulating interest rates like LIBOR, and those pension accounts are now bankrupt, these jobs don't pay that kind of rate of return, again, because they manipulate interest rates lower, because they confiscate wealth. Pools of money that are supposed to be accumulating a passive rate of interest are getting nothing because of manipulation now proven, and that excess capital is flowing into the pockets of bailouts, and then that money goes to a banker who then buys an apartment on Billionaires Row, and it sits there completely underutilized as dead money.
And then they say, well, you know, you Generation Xers, you know what else you should do? Consider switching jobs, because they say Generation is famous for living in the now, and part of that is what sort of jobs they take. The gig economy, which provides the freedom to work from anywhere in the world and work only when you want to, has become a popular option among this generation. But when it comes to preparing for retirement, the gig economy is probably not the best career choice. Instead, they say, because the gig economy, I'm working for all these delivery companies or Uber or blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe you should get a job, they suggest, working for the government or school systems, which i.e. the government.
Again, this is where it gets pernicious and ugly, because of course those government jobs are operating drones. You know, so hey, get into debt by, again, manipulation of the debt and student market by the same bankers, and then you graduate, you can't get a job you want to get, you have to get a job that pays you amount of money to pay off your debt, and by the way, that's as a drone operator dropping bombs on kids in somewhere Afghanistan or elsewhere, Syria.
Well, they're also talking about jobs in municipal government, city government, state government, federal government as a bureaucrat, or, you know, a tax collector. And what they don't tell you, but we on Keiser Report spoke about only a few episodes ago, we mentioned that private corporations, why they've cut pension benefits, is because they have to account for their pension obligations in real time. Whereas city and municipalities, they can lie and pretend that, yeah, we're going to have an 8% return one day somewhere in the future, and they get to, by law, just change the tax rates. You're sitting there and you're ever-rising property price, but they're going to suddenly say, we're going to charge you 15% a year on tax instead of just 1%.
Yeah, and of course they're saying get a government job, which is encouraging people to work for the dead hand of the state, as you would describe Soviet Union era economic model. Okay, that's not an entrepreneurial job. That's not a growth job. That's not a new job. That's about working for the government in a dead end job, and it puts a kibosh on any economic growth in any meaningful way. So yeah, good idea.
And of course, one thing we've always been told, many Generation X are saddled with debt, not as much as the generation below us, but student debt. It's student debt. Here is a remarkable story in the headline this week, talking about the dead hand of the state. Well, loans designed to fail. States say Navient preyed on students. Navient is a division of Sallie Mae. Remember, Sallie Mae used to be a government-sponsored entity, kind of like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Well, then it was put into private, it was floated on the stock market, now it's in private hands, and then lo and behold, the fraud began. Sallie Mae got its start more than 30 years ago as a government-sponsored enterprise collecting payments on loans that were backed by a federal guarantee. By the mid-2000s, Sallie Mae had become a for-profit, publicly traded company, no longer tied to the government, although it still made most of its money by originating federally guaranteed student loans. So Navient is the bad loan part of it, and apparently they are, so in order to get the government to back all these student loans, these schools have to have at least 10% of their students have private loans. So 50 to 92% of those are going bankrupt. They're defaulting, 50 to 92%, because they highlight the case of this 33-year-old woman living in Oregon now, and she took out a $150,000 loan to get a degree in photography from one of these fake schools, essentially. She has been paying $1,300 a month to pay back this loan, and her principal amount has only gone down $1,000. In the 9 years, she's been paying $1,300 a month.
Well, you mentioned this bad bank. You know, this is part of the scams that we've been exposed to the past 10, 15, 20 years, where every time banks make bad loans, instead of being punished in any way, like CEOs get a reduction in their salary, or there is a stock price event like it goes down, they simply parse that off from the balance sheet and say, here's our bad bank, and then somehow magically all these bad bank assets end up on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve Bank. In order to keep that rolling along without having to suffer any consequences for the people who created originally that sin, they keep interest rates at artificially low levels, like manipulating LIBOR down lower.
So we just said that, you know, they told Generation X, start working for the government. Get the stupid taxpayers to pay for all your failure to save, or inability to save because you're working in the gig economy. Then they say, in this case, why Sally Mae? Sally Mae is only in business. It's a private enterprise, but it's entirely funded by the federal taxpayer. They say those subprime loans that they were giving these students, like this woman in Oregon, were a bargaining chip, the government lawyers say. A tool Sally Mae used to build relationships with schools so that the company could take more federal loans to their students. The federal loans were the real prize because they came with a built-in safety net. If a borrower defaulted, the government would step in and reimburse the lender for its losses. Now remember, student loans you cannot discharge them in bankruptcy, and you can't. Also, when students go to one of these schools like Trump University or this photography school, basically they sign an arbitration agreement, so they can't sue the school for the bad education they got. But these attorneys general of these states are now starting to sue for all these bogus schools.
Right, and it all comes back to a willingness by the government and central banks to manipulate interest rates no matter who gets hurt. Anyway, we've got to go to the second half, so thanks so much.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to talk to Chris Whalen, author of this instant classic, Ford Men, burning up the charts all over. Chris, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, so here's the book, Ford Men, From Inspiration to Enterprise. Henry Ford is the subject. I guess we found out some things about Henry Ford that were myths. Tell us about that part.
Well, the book's about the people who helped Henry be successful. He would never have done this by himself, despite what you hear on television and at the Ford Museum. Really, I think the essence of the myth starts off with the assembly line. Did Henry Ford invent the modern assembly line? The answer is no. A Danish engineer named Charles Sorensen, who worked for Henry, one of the early Ford men, ran the company for 40 years. He did it because there was so much demand for cars. They had to figure out a way to do it quicker.
So what is the kernel of the Ford phenomenon? He just identified a market?
He had a vision. He was somewhat like Steve Jobs. He had had 2 failed businesses before Ford Motor Company was created. Some investors put more money behind him. They didn't tell anyone because he was such, a really scandalous individual in Detroit in those days.
How so?
Well, he liked to race and tinker, but he was not a very good businessman. So the third time around, they kept it quiet for a while, but then eventually they went out and raised money. The Dodge brothers were original shareholders in Ford, Horace Dodge.
Right.
And, so the things came together because of all the Ford men helping Henry. It wasn't Henry's vision. Henry's vision was make cars cheap enough so that lots of people can buy them.
But isn't that, typical CEO behavior? They always say, I surround myself with people smarter than I am.
Right.
And a lot of people say that, CEO types, and so it kind of fits that. Was he one of the first to be that way?
Well, he wasn't CEO. He wasn't even an officer of the company when it first started. He was a guy with an idea, and he had a reputation for making cars. So people came together around him, put money behind him, and off they went. But James Couzens, one of the original Ford men, is the guy who managed the business. And one day he said, Henry, we're selling cars. I'm putting an advertisement in the newspaper. They didn't even have a factory.
Was he a good salesman?
No, he did not enjoy being in public.
He just attracted the money with his vision.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, another myth, or maybe not a myth, you tell me, is this idea that they pay the people on the assembly line enough to buy the car. What's that? The story.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, the great increase in wages. My sense from my research is that was James Couzens. Couzens had been a young man when he first put a little bit of money into Ford. He scraped together all the money he could get from his family, invested it. every shareholder in Ford got their money back in the first year. That's how successful the company was. More than that, I think as he became more and more wealthy, Cousins was really haunted by his wealth. So one day he walks into Henry Ford's office and says, you know, things are tough in Detroit. We're making tons of money. Why don't we raise wages so more people can buy our cars? To your point, right? And they went back and forth and they approved it. Henry Ford took the credit because James Cousins always pushed Henry Ford out there. He was Mr. Ford. And that's fine.
He's like the Ronald McDonald.
That's right. But the business acumen, the real sense of what was right, what was fair, was, I think, represented by James Cousins.
Okay, well, that's actually not a fair comparison to say Ronald McDonald. But I mean, he was a figurehead. So did it work when they raised prices? Did that work? And can we learn anything from that in our present day, where the discussion is about wages and raising the minimum wage and how does it impact the economy and real wages haven't increased? Is there something to learn from this?
It didn't hurt, but those were tough times. The 20s and the 30s in the United States, you had a surplus of workers, you had inflation, which was a big problem in those days. So I would say it certainly helped the Ford workers, but Ford was not a fun place to work. Ford was a sweatshops with gangs of toughs keeping their eye on you. Ford had very strict work rules. You couldn't smoke, you couldn't do anything. You just were working for Mr. Ford. It was like a plantation. So, you know, it's hard to say in the grand scheme of things if it helped or not, but I'll tell you what didn't help. Henry Ford didn't like the idea of change. He made the Model T for 2 decades, and by 1927, when it was clearly antiquated and it could no longer compete with the beautiful cars that General Motors was making, they had to shut down the plant for over a year in 1927. That probably contributed to the Great Depression 2 years later.
Interesting. So this really is a part of the fabric of the American business, an American century, as it's called, and Wall Street, and it all comes together.
Goldman Sachs. There's a very, very significant part of this story involving Sidney Weinberg, the great Goldman partner, all the way through to the present day. In fact, you could argue that the Goldman bankers who sat on the Ford board are the most important Ford men of all.
How about this story that for a time there, didn't they create a whole country outside of America down in, I forget the details, Fordville or Fordland?
That's right.
Fordland.
And they had rubber plantations in Brazil. You know, I can't even remember. It was down in Latin America. I don't spend any time on that in the book. That was another one of Henry Ford's distractions. He barely spent time on the business. In fact, I would tell you that Edsel Ford knew more about manufacturing cars in a modern sense than his father did. He was really a brilliant, lovely individual.
And he gets a lot of shade because of the Edsel model vehicle, I guess, didn't sell well, and that's how we know him in history.
Well, they didn't give it a chance. That was Robert McNamara's disaster, frankly. And then he goes off to become Secretary of Defense. The car itself...
McNamara was active at that time?
Yeah, he was head of Ford for 51 days.
Because we know him from the Vietnam War.
Well, yeah.
And then later confessing to all of his crimes.
Probably the best thing that happened to Ford Motor Company was McNamara leaving.
Right. And again, it's intricately woven into the fabric of the century, the American century. And it's the only company of the big three during the big financial crisis that did not get a bailout.
That's right.
Tell us about that. Why?
Well, Ford didn't want a bailout for a number of reasons, but in particular, it's a family-owned company. If they had to file bankruptcy and seek support from the U.S. government, the Ford family probably would have lost their special voting rights that come with the stock. The other thing is that they might have had to contribute to the bankruptcy estate because they had pulled money out right before the crisis. And there's some question as to whether or not that would have gone in their favor. So, you know, all in all, they should be saluted for not filing bankruptcy. What they did instead was they went out and borrowed $20 billion and they restructured the company. That's what Alan Mulally did. And, you know, great operator.
Now, you know, we were on the show last time, right, as we were leading up to the election, and you predicted Trump would win, one of the very few people to actually make that prediction. And, of course, now we're in the Trump presidency. He talks about the jobs and cars, and, of course, the cars are made in Mexico. And so my question is that a realistic program going forward, the idea that Trump will bring those jobs back? Is that going to happen? As it's been described, can those jobs that Ford has kind of exported to Mexico and elsewhere, can they come back? What's the status there?
No, you would have to impose a really protectionist regime and not let foreign cars in if you wanted to do that, and U.S. cars would get much more expensive. So it would be the opposite of what Henry Ford tried to do. He tried to make cars cheaper and take value out so more people could buy them. the only way you can have U.S. workers doing that low-end manufacturing and parts making and that sort of stuff that they do in Mexico today or other countries would be to dramatically raise prices. I don't think that's going to happen. I think a lot of this stuff from Trump is just kerfluffle. It's just rhetoric. It's about politics more than substance.
Now, if I watch public television, they say this program is sponsored in part from the Ford Foundation. What is that? What is the Ford Foundation?
Well, the Ford Foundation was the way that the Ford family kept the company after Henry Ford died. FDR hated Henry Ford because he had supported Germany during the war.
Right, FDR hated Ford.
That's right.
During the war. There was a lot of businessmen who were kind of pro-Germany. The
that's
National
right.
Socialist movement at that time. There was Disney.
That's right.
Coca-Cola.
Lindbergh.
Ford, because they hated, they perceived as a threat of communism.
Well, there was that, but you got to remember, this was a German country. This is still a very predominantly Northern European
Hey, Max
country.
Keiser, you don't tell me about it. You know,
There you
from
go.
German stock.
But the thing that the Ford Foundation was created so that the Ford family could give away 90% of the value of the company, but keep voting control of Ford. Goldman Sachs helped to engineer it, of course.
Right.
And you know, it was a very innovative transaction.
What I like about
brilliant.
this book, Ford Men, Chris Whalen is the author, is that it is really pivotal for the, what's called the American century. In probably the most pivotal industry of the century, I would think cars are kind of the industry.
Defined America.
Defined America, and the American dream, the open road going west, the wide open highway. That, I guess let's segue into that a little bit, because the car today, this is more philosophical, forgive me, but is less a means of liberation than it once was. And people now, the younger generation, is more interested in their laptop, their computer, the Steve Jobs you mentioned earlier.
Well, millennials don't buy cars.
Right. What's the future there, and how does Elon Musk fit into this, and how come his company's worth more than all the big car companies?
Well, Elon is selling an idea. He's the best salesman since P.T. Barnum. And God bless him, but I don't think that company will ever make
He's
money.
An entrepreneur. Why are you throwing shade on Elon? I mean, he's an
Well,
entrepreneur.
as long as he has
on Wall Street.
as long as he has other people's money, he's an entrepreneur.
But all these companies, fake it till you make it. That's the way it goes.
That's right. That's right.
So why Elon? Because he took a preponderance of government money originally.
Yes, he did. I also.
Is that why he gets such
I'm
slack?
dubious about an electric car,
Okay.
except in cities. In the city, it makes a lot of sense. Generally in America's a big country, you need to have at least a hybrid because you have to have a power source. Now, he builds beautiful cars, don't get me wrong, but the same conversation that Henry Ford had with Thomas Edison 100 years ago about how should I power my car is relevant today. Because the only thing that's happened is the motors are more efficient, we have phones, but the batteries haven't changed a whole lot. And the whole notion of just battery power for cars, I take issue with in the book.
During World War II, was Ford also brought into going from cars to munitions, that whole transition? Was that part of the story?
Well, his managers did.
They did?
Yeah, against his wishes. And his son, Edsel, again.
World War II is kind of a dicey period, I guess.
It was a very dicey period. Well, FDR almost took over Ford. They didn't do it because DuPont controlled GM at the time, this huge monopoly, and they didn't want to have the government controlling one and have the DuPont mega corporation controlling the other company. They wanted to try and maintain some competition. So that's the only thing that saved the Fords and Edsel. Edsel was the voice of reason in the Ford family.
So it sounds like this book does something that is sorely needed, and that Henry Ford is a bit of an ephemeral character.
Yes, he's the first Steve Jobs.
Yeah, so you have to really look at he's defined by his absence almost.
Very much, very much. The company really survived despite him. If he had had his way, he would have destroyed the whole thing.
Right, so you brought this all together, and that's a lot different than writing credit reports for banks.
Yes, it is.
A lot more bread and butter.
A lot more fun.
So how was that transition? I mean, we have a minute left, but going from, analyst to author.
Well, this book is more fun in a sense that you can be a little bit whimsical and also, I think, deal with some of the qualitative aspects of American life. You can describe what Detroit was like. Why are car companies in Detroit? It's because immigrants came down the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then when they got there, they needed a wagon. So everybody in this story, the Dodge brothers, they all worked in wagon shops.
Right.
And then one day, Henry Ford says, well, I can put a gasoline engine on the back of the wagon, which is today's pickup truck.
So that was that one little insight kind of launched this whole phenomenon.
But there were others, and if Henry Ford hadn't been lucky, you and I would be sitting here talking about the Dodge brothers.
Yeah, yeah.
Who were the dominant players at the time. They were the first parts makers. They made parts for all the other car makers.
Right. All right. Well, Chris Whalen, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure. Anytime, Max, especially if we can hang in Central Park.
Super. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Chris Whalen. This is the book, Ford Men, From Inspiration to Enterprise, the book Jim Rickards calls the best book since my book. Until next time, Max Keiser. If you want to reach us on Twitter, by the way, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.